Hello again, everybody. Here we are for the lecture on Post-Impressionism, the third section on Post-Impressionism, and we're looking now at the work of a group of artists who are collectively known as the Symbolists. So they have a common goal, more so than a common visual style. So the Symbolists are post-impressionist artists who I would argue are pretty heavily influenced by the Romantics, by artists who liked to tell stories, particularly dramatic stories, and particularly stories that had kind of fanciful or even mythological elements. So some of the artists to look out for in this section here are Moreau, Redon, Edvard Munch, who you'll know from the painting The Scream, and an American painter, Albert Pinkham Ryder. So we'll see some rather interesting takes on how to tell a story here now that we have gotten a little bit away from the pure obsession with proportion and anatomical accuracy that you saw in neoclassical and romantic. You're now going to see things loosen up a little bit as we approach a different way of thinking about emotional storytelling. This is the work of Gustave Moreau, and Moreau, I really quite like his attitude toward art making. I really like these words. I believe neither in what I touch nor what I see. I only believe in what I do not see, and solely in what I feel. So these artists are taking some of the focus that the Impressionists and even Post-Impressionists had on looking at things directly and making art from them, and moving into making art that is more from the imagination or more from emotion. It's kind of interesting to think about the fact that Van Gogh and Gauguin, when they worked side by side, Gauguin often mocked Vincent and made fun of Vincent van Gogh because he always had to look at something to be able to make a painting of it, whereas Gauguin felt that he could make things from his imagination or from memory. And so some of the symbolists are leaning a little bit more toward what Gauguin's approach might have been like. So this is a painting about Oedipus and the Sphinx. And the story of Oedipus is a pretty remarkable one. Oedipus' father was given a prophecy that his son would rise up one day and kill him. So his dad did what any father would do. He arranged to have one of his servants take the kid out to the woods and kill him. And of course, the servant decides he can't do it. He gives the child to a farm couple who raise him. He eventually grows up, becomes strong and athletic and a warrior, and comes back, not knowing that he originally is from this place, encounters his father on the road. They get into an argument. There's a fight. He kills him. So the prophecy is fulfilled. When he arrives at the capital of his father's territory or kingdom, there is a terrible plague that's brought about by the Sphinx, and that's the creature there with the head and neck and upper torso of a woman with eagle wings, the body of a lion. It's a mythological creature of terror, terrorizing the people. She can only be defeated if you can best her in a game of riddles. And the riddle that the Sphinx asks is kind of an interesting one. She asks the riddle, what goes on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs at night? And Oedipus solves the riddle, and he says it's a man, because you crawl on all 4s as a baby, you stand on 2 legs as a young adult to your middle age, and you might walk with a cane as you are approaching the end of your life. So he defeats the Sphinx, the reward of which is to marry the queen, who unbeknownst to him is his mother. When it's all revealed what the actual relationship is, Jocasta, his mother, blinds herself, or rather commits suicide, and then Oedipus takes the brooches from her dress and stabs out his own eyes. He blinds himself, and he becomes kind of a wandering blind prophet. So a good dramatic story that comes to us from ancient Greece, and what we're seeing here is kind of Moreau's take on that story. He definitely also does mythological things, visions, with stories that are closer to home. This story actually comes to us from the Bible. This is the story of Salome. Salome is the daughter of the queen. The queen is remarried. Her stepfather has captured John the Baptist and is trying to get John the Baptist to act as a prophet for him, which of course John the Baptist has no interest in doing. He also has an obsession with his stepdaughter, with Salome, and she is trying to manipulate him to get what she wants, which is romantic involvement with John the Baptist. So she kind of plays a little bit of a trick on her stepfather. The stepfather promises her anything in his kingdom if she will perform the dance of the seven veils, which of course is basically a striptease. So Salome agrees to do it. She does the dance of the seven veils and then demands John the Baptist as her payment. And of course, John the Baptist wants nothing to do with her, so she acquiesces to having John's head on a plate. And that is seen here in a way that isn't really literal to the way the story is told, but you see John the Baptist's severed head and his saintly powers kind of glowing from the center point, kind of shaming her. You see her as just kind of wrestling with this idea. So this is a take on a religious story that feels almost more like a mythological one. Moreau's Jupiter and Semele is an interesting one as well. Semele is definitely a normal human being, and Jupiter falls in love with her. So Jupiter, or Zeus, of course, is constantly falling in love with human beings. His wife, Hera, or the Roman name Juno, becomes incredibly jealous, and so she tricks Semele into asking Jupiter Zeus to show himself in his true form. And as he does that, she's unable to handle the glory of seeing a god in its actual real form. She bursts into flames. And so there's the end of their romance. Little does Juno realize that Semele is actually carrying a child who is immortal because he's the son of Zeus, and that's Bacchus. There's our god of wine. So a good tragic story, mythological elements here that are depicted in a way that are definitely different from how any romantic painter would have rendered the scene, giving us more of an emphasis on sort of abstract use of space and over-the-top drama in the poses of the body. There's Moreau's Jupiter and Semele. One of my personal favorite symbolist pieces here is Redon's, I love this title, "The Eye Like a Strange Balloon Mounts Toward Infinity." His images almost all feel they're coming from some kind of strange, perhaps nightmare, or certainly a dream, but don't those feel like surrealism? The art that you love, you know you're melting clock painting, right? The art of Salvador Dali falls into the surrealist category. That's not going to happen until the 1930s. So here we are, like 50 years ahead of the time, giving a sense of what is to come from artists who really delve more into imagination than observation. Here's a Redon vision of the Sphinx. The Sphinx is the reddish figure there toward the bottom left, obviously surrounded by what look like butterflies and strange movements of either dust motes or reflections of light. It's hard to even know. It's a very abstract image, this one. And then the Redon to know for the test is called the Cyclops, another mythological figure who seems to be peering at this female form. There's obviously a kind of sexual connotation to the image, but I don't think any of us would be fooled into believing it's a realistic three-dimensional rendering of space. It feels almost like the kind of texture pattern that we saw happening with the work of some of the Nabi as well, just a few lectures ago. When we look here at the work of Rousseau, you definitely are seeing a different take. Each artist kind of has his or her own way of doing things. Rousseau's art is a little bit more naive in some ways, more simplistic, and definitely a bit egotistical. Rousseau was not really formally trained as a painter. In fact, he had worked as a toll collector, as a customs official, and he overlapped the time period that Picasso was living and working in Paris. And he had quite an ego about his own work. Henry Rousseau really believed that he and Picasso were the two greatest living artists, and Picasso actually threw him a special party. They made a crown and they gave him a special chair, like a throne to sit in. And I've never truly understood what he meant by this, but Rousseau proclaimed that there were only two great artists of the 20th century, himself and Picasso, that Rousseau, was the master of the modern style, while Picasso was the master of the Egyptian style. I can only guess that by Egyptian he meant the composite, the way that in Egyptian hieroglyphics and paintings, the head is always rendered in profile, but the eyes look as though you're looking at someone head on, so two different points of view at once. Guess that is Rousseau's interpretation of Cubism, more than one point of view at once. Kind of interesting. But you probably know Rousseau's paintings like this. This is a fairly famous one, The Sleeping Gypsy, which again looks as though we're looking in on some kind of a dream. There's no way that you'd be safe in that situation, that close to a lion, but I think that it feels safe, as if you're somehow getting a message from nature in your dreams. You may even have seen this as well. This one is literally called The Dream. Why there's a beautiful piece of furniture like a couch in the middle of this jungle is kind of bizarre, right? But you start to get a feeling of what Rousseau is really all about with these works. Perhaps the most famous symbolist image of all, this one, Edvard Munch's The Scream, also known as The Cry. And he did multiple versions of this. This is the most famous one for sure. The story of Edvard Munch's life is probably instrumental in understanding what the work is all about, because at first it just looks like he can't draw, right? It looks like a skull with no hair and a body that's made into some kind of curved form. If you instead think less about it looking like a portrait of a specific person and think more about the structure of just the human body, then yeah, skull kind of makes sense, which could represent male or female, I suppose. And the expression on the face is one of complete panic/horror. The sky is kind of a blood red, it's swirling about. The landscape behind him doesn't seem to be going back in space as much as it seems to be going up into the air, and there are ominous figures in the background coming toward us across this bridge or along this embankment, wherever that railing is dividing us from that space on the other side. The image we know he made after having, there's a diary entry about taking a walk under an intensely red sky and feeling a certain amount of despair and anxiety. I think he may have experienced a panic attack and then painted that emotion into this image. It would not surprise me at all to think that Edvard Munch was suffering from depression just from the circumstances of his life. We know that he lost both his mother and his most beloved, closest sister. She died when he was 14. His mother died when he was 5. So two of the most influential women in his life were gone before he had reached maturity. We also know that he did stage designs for plays by Henrik Ibsen, which are heavily symbolic. If you ever have an opportunity to read or see a performance of an Ibsen play, there's a lot of heavy symbolism in those stage productions. We know he was influenced by Gauguin, and that's pretty clear here, that what he's getting at is not just painting objective reality, but painting our response to it. This painting, ironically enough, was stolen in 2004 and was missing until 2006. There's an actual photograph of the thieves walking out of the museum with the paintings. There was no security. They didn't have an alarm on the mechanism that connects the painting or hangs the painting to the wall. They straight up just walked out the door with them. They were prosecuted, and the work has been returned. So I don't know if you saw the news recently, but there's a Van Gogh painting that was stolen right at the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak. Hopefully that will be covered as well. This is a Munch painting that clearly references his childhood. It's called Death in the Sick Room, and it's not a painting of direct observation. It's a painting of memory, and probably the memory of both losses kind of combined together into one. It's extremely emotional. It's obviously very dark. The figures express sorrow in their poses, in the facial expressions, and even in the way they kind of blend into one another in that foreground group of three. One of my favorites of Munch's is actually this piece. It's called The Dance of Life, and it represents really, in a way, the same woman at three different points in her life. On the left, in the white dress with a little bit of pattern to it, is a woman who represents youth. We could think of her perhaps as the Virgin. The woman in red in the center, clearly in the romantic kind of dance and embrace, is the woman in the middle of her life. So if the first one is the maiden, then the second one is the figure who will soon become the mother. The figure at the far right in black, who's looking on in a little bit of a questionable kind of expression. She looks wistful, sad, angry. It's hard to know exactly what that face is expressing. She represents the older age, what we might refer to as the crone, not as someone meant to be depicted in a negative light. We mean crone in this sense as someone who's gained knowledge through age. So the whole thing becomes loaded with symbolic meaning. Other symbolists include James Ensor, a Belgian painter, definitely had some interesting attitude about what art was. His words here: all the rules, all the canons of art vomit death, which I think is kind of funny. In a sense, he's saying that we need to get away from the old ways of doing things. In that vein, you see him kind of updating this character that we've seen before. Isn't this one of the Commedia dell'arte characters? But he's now surrounded by these scary masks that are a little bit more contemporary, more modern. There are a lot of masked faces in Ensor's work. There's a reference back to that Perrault character that we met back in Watteau's painting from the Rococo. One of my personal favorites of the symbolists in America is Albert Pinkham Ryder, and this painting is kind of an intriguing one. A lot of Ryder's paintings are very dark blacks, browns and grays, and a little bit of yellow. They're somewhat similar in that color palette, but the stories they tell are frequently different. This particular one is based on Götterdämmerung. It is a cycle of operatic musical pieces by Wagner, and it tells a story that might sound somewhat familiar if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, because Götterdämmerung is about the loss, recovery, and the use of a ring of power, which is kind of an intriguing idea. The piece that is most likely going to stick in your mind, this is the moonlight marine scene. You can see a couple of boats on the water and moonlight above, is this piece, Ryder's The Racetrack, also known as Death on a Pale Horse. And you can clearly see a figure with a synth on the horse. Below him, though, you see a snake. And of course, in Judeo-Christian symbolic language, a snake is always going to be a reference to Satan. So here you see death and sin kind of mixed together, as if your life is one big loop of either outrunning one or the other of those two forces. Pretty remarkable.